السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بإذن الله سنبدأ مع مركز تطوير التعليم وفعالية اليوم 27 بقيادة الدكتورة عايشة العازمي، وستكون الفعالية بإذن الله تعالى مع قيادة الدكتورة منيرة. ستستضيف معنا الدكتور الفاضل حول الموضوع المطروح في الإعلام. فلتتفضل دكتورة منيرة مشكورة، ونرحب بجميع الجمهور المتواجد معنا في البث المباشر. شكرا لكم.
Hi all, this is Dr. Munira Al-Halim from Kuwait University College of Education, Department of Educational Administration and Planning. I welcome you all in the fourth day of activities related to the forum done by the Education Development Center titled the COVID-19 and how is it changing the nature of education. I'm more than happy to present our amazing speaker for today, Mr. Hamish Forsyth. Mr. Hamish Forsyth is a co-founder and CEO at Waleeb. Waleeb helps leading corporates and family entities to be more entrepreneurial. They build innovative new venture and grow existing business. They develop more entrepreneurial leaders through customized executive development. They help organizations define and do their innovation strategies through building strategic communities. Waleeb draws on 300 organizations and companies across 35 countries. They work with companies and government in the UK, Europe, Asia, MEA, and US. And their work has been featured in Harvard Business Review. The specialist of the speaker includes business, strategy, innovation, leadership, executive development. Today we are going to discuss many topics, many interesting topics actually, like the success of education institutions in exceptional circumstances, innovation in educational institutions, the role of successful leadership and guiding crisis workers, new strategies in administrative work in educational institutions. The title of our meeting today is leveraging the rest moment after COVID-19, which is a very important topic, and it's a part of activities introduced by Educational Development Center in the College of Education under the guidance of Dr. Aisha Al-Azmi. So many thanks to her and her team. And Mr. Hamish, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Munira, and thank you also, Dr. Aisha, for organizing this event. And I'm delighted to be speaking today with all who are on this talk. So allow me to bring up a few slides to guide us through this. The title of the talk today, as Dr. Munira said, is Leveraging the Reset Moment that is coming out of COVID-19. And I should say, as Dr. Munira noted, that my background is in business strategy and innovation. I have actually also worked in the UK government as an advisor to the Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street under one of the previous administrations, and I have some background in the government side. I'm not, however, an educational expert, but what I will hope to share with you today is some lessons from generally the business side of things that can be applied to your very particular situation. And I look forward to questions and dialogue on that at the end. But to get us started, my company, as Dr. Munira mentioned, exists to help leading organizations grow and transform by being more entrepreneurial. And the entrepreneurial mindset, I don't just mean building businesses, I mean the ability to change things dramatically for great impact, is going to be a big theme that we discuss today. And in my organization, as Dr. Munira kindly mentioned, we've been featured in Harvard Business Review, in part for the way in which we use the insights of thousands of successful entrepreneurs to help large organizations and companies innovate. So these are very much the perspectives that I'll be coming from in our discussion today. I want to start by facing head-on COVID-19. Because in my view, it is both a tragedy and a reset opportunity. So first, the tragedy. When we looked at the numbers this morning, the death toll stands at almost 3.5 million. That is something we should pause to think about. And there are many parts of the world in which this death toll is skyrocketing. India in particular, also many Latin American countries. I know a number of places in the Gulf region are also severely affected still. And according to the Economist's estimate, the total economic cost will be in the vicinity of $10 trillion. So I don't take this lightly when I start to talk about the opportunities, because there has been a lot of human tragedy and suffering. Nonetheless, today we will be speaking about not just getting through COVID, but what comes next. And that is where I do believe there is a once in a generation opportunity. And that's what we'll be discussing. Einstein actually put that in his own words. He said, in the midst of any crisis lies a great opportunity. And what I would suggest to you today is that that opportunity is perhaps at its greatest in the educational sphere that you all operate in. And the reason for that is the educational sphere, the academic sphere, is an amazing place to work, but it has unique institutional and cultural challenges. And I have some background here to the extent my wife is in academia, and I know that from firsthand experience, how challenging the pressure for perfectionism, for example, can be. And this, in fact, here represents the words of a professor at the end of the Second World War. And the Second World War, of course, was a great tragedy. But he opined that the war enabled the temporary repression of traditional academic perfectionism. So he believed that without the Second World War, his institution and many other universities, in particular in the United States, could not possibly have engaged in the great innovations that reshaped their faculties and set the course for education for much of the 20th century. And I'll come back to why that is shortly. So let's first of all be clear on what we mean by a reset moment. So in its simplest sense, there is a reset coming out of COVID because COVID created a burning platform. This is an analogy some of you might be familiar with. It's the idea that if you are out on an oil rig and there is suddenly a fire, you will do things that you would otherwise never do. You would literally jump off a burning platform into the water to save yourself. Of course, it's scary. Of course, it's risky. But in the circumstance of a fire on board that platform, that oil rig, you would do it, because if you did not, you would risk almost certain death. And so what COVID did is it forced us to change rules or question fundamental assumptions about what customers expect, what students expect, what faculty expect, how business works, how government and society works. All of these were questioned or overturned very, very quickly because in certain circumstances, there were no other choices. And that leads to two very specific innovation opportunities once COVID ends. The first is what I call adaptations that stick. These are the things that we did, the changes we made, the jumps off the platform that we made, and all we have to do is keep with them, just not reverse back to normal. The second type are what I call upheavals, and they are more when we say there's such a fundamental change in our world coming out of this great tragedy that there is an opportunity to step back and reflect and ask, why are we even here? What is the function of our institution, our business, our university, our discipline? And they are two quite distinct opportunities coming out of the reset moment. Let me explain that by reference to Simon Sinek, who is a popular theorist and writer around motivation in particular. And he often talks about the centrality of the why question. So we have to be absolutely clear on why we exist, why our business exists, our university exists. Then we think about what we do to pursue the purpose, to pursue the why. And then last of all, we think about how we go about making that what happen, which in turn drives the why. So for these adaptations that stick, as I call them, what we're fundamentally saying is we're going to continue with the purpose we always had. We're not changing our why, But we're going to think about the how we do things. And that may have changed as a result of COVID, and we may keep those changes. Sometimes that might include some of the what that we do as well. Let's make that a little more concrete. So remote learning and working are a classic example. Much of the work that has happened during COVID, much of the learning that's happened has had the same fundamental content. It's just that the how has changed, the way in which we go about doing it. If it was an adaptation that would stick, we would just carry on doing it. We might absolutely improve on it, but we would keep at least some elements of it. The next is telemedicine. In many countries, the risk that was existing in a situation where you had to go and see a doctor was so great that telemedicine was already happening, but it was accelerated rapidly. And coming out of that, people find the convenience something they may want to keep. Again, medicine hasn't fundamentally changed, but the way we practice it and deliver it may have. In an area that crosses over with education, reduction in bureaucracy is a big one. I'll give you a very personal example. I had to shift countries during COVID, which wasn't particularly easy. I had to sell my car remotely. And before, that would have required in the United States to go through a complex legal process. I'd have to visit a lawyer in person. There'd be lots of stamps, lots of paperwork. It would take a very long time and it would be risky. So the state legislature passed emergency legislation enabling the various legal procedures to be done online. Never happened before. And now people are saying that saves so much time. It gives so much more time to do valuable things like innovate, for example, that maybe we should keep some of those things that way. Another example that I was reading about on the World Economic Forum education blog is the shift away from measuring inputs to measuring outcomes. That was already happening in education. But when you can no longer count the number of people that turn up because it's physically impossible, and when you have an online platform where you can see the quality of the dialogue and the conversations, and you can measure them, you can apply analytics to them, it's really possible to shift towards outcomes. And again, that's both scary, but also full of opportunities. That is an adaptation that could stick. There's some examples of those adaptations. I want to turn now to upheavals. And when I talk about an upheaval, we're less talking about changing the how and more talking about certainly changing the what, but maybe even questioning the why as a source of innovation. So this is a picture just towards the end of the Second World War at a United States campus. And this is where the professor came from who provided that quote before: by the temporary suspension of this perfectionism, we were able to really innovate. Well, what this institution did is it did make some adaptations during the war. It became a lot more focused on operations because that was relevant to the war effort. But at the end, they didn't just stick with operations teaching in their curriculum. They took a step back and they said, we're a business school. We are behaving rather like an economics faculty with largely theoretical knowledge. Why do we exist? Shouldn't we be doing something much more practical and applied and usable? And they made the decision to shift away from effectively being an extension of the economics faculty to become what a business school is today. And that business school was Harvard Business School. And that set the standard for what modern business education looks like and still looks like. So that's an example of the power in education of using one of these fundamental reset moments to question the why of your existence, your whole purpose. And of course, there are a lot of others of these that came out of the Second World War as well. And the new international monetary system came into existence. The participation of women in Western workforces, all these things were fundamental upheavals. They weren't just mere adaptations. Some would argue today that the movement towards cryptocurrency, a new source of financial security, is a direct response to a lack of trust, given how many governments failed the COVID test that came out of that. Others might argue that we're prepared to embrace a new era of big government, much bigger role for government than ever before, certainly in Western economies, simply because we've had demonstrated to us that government has a much bigger purpose than just sitting in the background. And we never would have seen that but for COVID. So these big fundamental upheavals are opportunities available too. In education, one of the things, again, I read about recently was the idea that it's not just a question of technology being an enabler. The reality is when we do really truly technology-enabled learning in a virtual setting, we rely much more on our students to collaborate with us because it's simply not possible to get the same rich learning experience without a more equal partnership between the students and the professors. Again, that's a fundamental way of rethinking the function of education. Now, I'm not saying you should do all or even some of these. What I am trying to say is that the reset moment provides an opportunity to think really quite big, as well as thinking about the adaptations that you could stick with. So, huge opportunity if you act on it now, but bear in mind that the sense of momentum will not last indefinitely. Adaptations are the current default, meaning a lot of institutions are already doing them. They're yours to lose effectively if you go away from them. And people are open to upheavals now. So many big things have changed in the world. A lot of people do compare COVID to the equivalent of a world war in terms of its impact, that people are open for trying things they wouldn't otherwise be open to. So that's the basic argument for the reset moment. But there is an obvious question here, and it's, but what was wrong with what we had before? And I had this, I was hosting an in-person event that I was very fortunate to be able to do in the Asia Pacific the other day, in a country where there is the ability to have some in-person contact. And a number of people made the point that the place they want to run to is before, because that was the safe, secure place and things were actually going quite well. Well, I'd like to suggest it may not be quite that simple. And there is, in fact, a real imperative to do that innovation. So in your case, you might say, we have this amazing award-winning campus, and I've seen some photos of it. It's incredibly impressive. You've got, as far as I could read, 22,000 students. You have this really important public mission, fantastic backing from the government that many institutions would be envious of. Why would you change? And then you might also say, you've heard my examples of like Harvard University and the big shifts that they made to fundamentally remake the function of various schools. And you might say, that's up there in those mountains and we're much, much earlier in our journey. That's such a long way to go. It doesn't even bear thinking about starting. But there are many compelling reasons why your institutions and others similarly placed should lean into this reset opportunity. First, and I think you'll be familiar with this, Kuwait is trending downwards on a series of major innovation indexes. This is the one run by Cornell University in INSEAD that uses the World Intellectual Property Office data. There is a clear downwards trend versus many other comparator countries. And being in the educational space, you're uniquely positioned to do something about it. Secondly, within the Gulf region, including specifically within Kuwait, this is a survey that was part paid for by CAFAS. Gulf CEOs highlighted that the conditions around innovation and the change needed to make that happen are among their top 5 critical obstacles to making progress coming into this year. And what's really interesting is that they're both things that leaders and only leaders can fix. These are not external things. Lack of an innovation culture and middle management resistance to change, they are squarely things that leaders can impact. Thirdly, your Honorable Emir just said, I think 10 days ago, or perhaps less, when he gave his update coming out of the crisis, he complimented the Kuwaiti people on their excellent resilience and response to COVID. But he said, we're now coming to a point where our most important priority is to take care of this new generation, and in particular, by qualifying them with the best means of modern scientific and academic success. So there's clearly very strong government support for doing everything that we can to move Kuwait forward here. You'll be aware of this, I'm sure, but we have debates over how much rankings matter in small amounts, but there does seem to be a fairly clear correlation between the number of top 500 universities per capita and the GDP per capita. This was a peer-reviewed study that was produced a few years ago, and it looked at this across right across the board, across a group of 50 countries. And the key point was, it's not even the top 100 universities that drive GDP per capita, it's actually the top 500 universities and the number of them that matter. Your university, Kuwait University, was fairly close to that top 500 not that long ago. And that is something that is within your achievement. And a number of people would argue that a more innovative approach is the key to that. And perhaps the last point, again, at a university level is this. It's ironic, given all the restrictions globally on travel, but COVID has made talent more mobile than we ever imagined. What do I mean by that? I mean that even though people couldn't travel, the fact that we opened up virtual ways of learning and teaching means that talent can go and feels free to go to many more places than before. If you look at the academic job boards globally, you'll see quite a large number of jobs now are available to do remotely, entirely remotely, in another country remotely. Now, this is just the beginning, but if universities do not keep up with these innovations, they risk losing fundamental faculty talent. And of course, students are available to do the same. So these are all reasons to take the imperative to innovate in your position very seriously indeed. That opportunity, as I've said, is now. So let's talk practically about what we can do about it. And in order to do that, we have to start by being really clear around what some of the barriers to innovating could be. And this is what my organization does, as its bread and butter, so to speak, and we don't have time to cover anything like all of them. So I'm going to pick a few I think would be interesting points to share and discuss. Here are my 4. Lack of ambition. That's where an organization isn't bold enough in the ambition, in the innovation it goes after. A lack of direction or permission from leadership. So people don't feel they know where to go with new ideas, or they don't feel they're allowed to do it. A culture of risk aversion. People feel that they will be disadvantaged or punished if something doesn't work, if they try a new experiment. And too much friction or a lack of agility. That's where people feel there's just so much bureaucracy, they don't have time to innovate, let alone even do their basic job, or it takes so long that the idea will die before it has a chance to live. So these are the 4 I'd like to discuss. But I'm not going to make any assumptions here. I'd like you to help us with this. So I'm going to show a link in a moment, and I think your colleagues will share this on the YouTube chat, and you can place this in your browser, on your phone, on your laptop if you're watching from there. Put that link in, and we've capped it at 25 responses because we want to make this a quick survey. But put that link into your responses, and we'll see whether you agree that these are significant barriers to innovation in education. So here's the link. I'm placing it up here. And you'll be asked about those barriers. If you strongly agree that they are a barrier to education, innovation, you'll give it a 5. If you strongly disagree, it's not a barrier at all. You're doing absolutely fine there. There are no challenges. Give it a 1 if you strongly disagree. So 5 if you agree it's a barrier, 1 if you don't, and the other scores are somewhere in between. So I'll just give a moment for that to be passed around. And my colleague here is going to get your responses, so they'll come in live. So let me just give you 30 seconds to do that. And hopefully we're getting some responses through. I'm told none have come through yet, so hopefully that link is going out, and hopefully some of you are in a position to do it. So I'll give it a few more moments. You can also, by the way, comment. I gather live in YouTube Live, and feel free to comment in Arabic, and that will be translated for me if you want to make any comments rather than answer that very, very quick survey. It'll take you about 15 seconds to complete. So I gather some results coming in now. 20 more seconds, I'm told. Yeah. And if it's not letting you go through anymore, it's designed to cap it. So if the link is not applying to you, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it's deliberately been designed to cut it off. And I'll ask my colleague, Ms. Laura, we have a set of results? We do, okay. So we're going to share her screen now to show you live the results. And lack of ambition is a barrier to innovation. 100% strongly agree. in education. So that's a very strong endorsement of that barrier. Let's have a look at the next one. Also 100% on lack of direction or permission as a barrier to innovation. Strongly agree there. The next barrier, culture of risk aversion, also strongly agree, 100%. And the final one, too much friction or bureaucracy being a barrier to innovation. Well, that's, I think, fairly definitive. So thank you all for filling that in. So strongly agree, these are 4 very significant barriers indeed. Okay, great. So let me return to where we were then and discuss what we can do about them. So my suggestion is that the fundamental thread that runs through all 4 of those is leadership. Now, that doesn't mean the leader has to do all the innovating, but it means there is a lot the leader can do to create the environment in which that innovating can occur and to remove and reduce those barriers. So what should leaders do? Leaders should not be the first violinist of innovation. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with music, but for those of you who aren't, in an orchestra, there are various sections. Violins are one, trumpets are another. The first violinist is the #1 player, the star. And one of the problems I would suggest in education is there is an equivalent of the first violinist, and it is the first named author in a peer-reviewed article. And so much of the culture in high-performing organizations, including universities, is around being that first violinist or that first named author. Yet what leaders need to do is not be that first violinist. They need to be the conductor, or they need to set the stage. So I spoke a number of years ago to a very talented man called Greg Brando. And Greg Brando was the chief technology officer of Pixar and the executive vice president of Disney. And they're generally considered to be one of the 10 most innovative, not to mention entertaining organizations in the world. And he said to me, your job is not to be the innovator, it is to set the stage for others, to draw on the collective genius, not be that most innovative, most prestigious first violin. And that's a very hard, but very important shift to make. So let's look at the things the leader then should do. So the first of those is about setting a high ambition. Let me give you an example from the business world. I worked a number of years ago alongside a very talented man, also by the name of Hamish, who was the CEO of Eurostar and also had a C-suite job in British Airways. And he had a challenge which was around the long lines of people getting stuck at check-in, if you remember the days when we could all travel freely. And he had a choice around how to deal with that problem. He could have asked his organization or his teams working on that to reduce the check-in lines by 25% or by 3 minutes, but he didn't. He said, eliminate check-in. And by setting that very high bar, he got a result, which is we can now check in and go straight to the plane in many cases with our phones. But if he had said, reduce it by 25%, what we probably would have got is not phone check-in. We probably would have got a slightly modified system of queuing or making lines, and we wouldn't have got nearly the great response we could have. At One Leap, we sometimes call this 50x thinking as opposed to 2x thinking. Now, the point here is just because you set a high ambition by no means guarantees that you'll achieve a massively innovative result. However, if you set a low ambition, the 2x thinking, reduce the line by 25%, you basically guarantee that you won't get a 50x really ambitious result. Let me give you one more example from business. This is the ultimate outcome to an exercise I gave to some executives at a large company in the UK. And the question I gave to them was, if your CEO came in, these were all human resources leaders, and said, people in our organization don't know how to talk to each other, I want you to get them to all understand each other's personalities better and apply it day to day. What would you do? And by the way, you've got 2 weeks to do it, and we have 400,000 people. So to begin with, they were just stunned. That's an impossible task. But they put their heads together and they worked out with all the contractors they knew, they could probably administer all these personality tests, Myers-Briggs test or DISC tests. I'm sure you're familiar with these. And they reckon they could get everybody to do one online in about 2 weeks. That's what I mean by 2x thinking. Existing technology, existing way of working, just work really, really hard and we get an outcome. What we showed them instead was there's a piece of software that's called Crystal. And what Crystal does is it automatically runs one of these tests on you using the contents of your emails, which has actually been proven to be a better indicator of response because it's not rehearsed. You're not thinking, how should I answer this question in the personality test? It's objectively analyzing the data in thousands and thousands of emails and other documents that you write. But not only that, it analyzes the data from emails that you send to colleagues. And so what it means is it can look at thousands and thousands of those emails, work out the personality using that same test that you would otherwise do manually. And when you next come to email them, it will suggest how you can communicate with them based on the results of that test. So instead of having a spelling and grammar checker, it has a personality checker based on those same tests, and it applies it directly as you're writing an email, which is what's happening here. You'll see he says, "Hey, Justin," and that's based on the test having been run through the data, saying that Justin is very relationship oriented, and so it automatically corrects how this email is being written. That's a 50x result, because not only can you do a whole lot of tests in literally a couple of hours, you can roll it out across the organization, but it actually gets to the outcome you want because it integrates the value of those tests, the understanding of the personality, into your communication with your colleagues. The second thing I want to touch on is providing a visualizable outcome and a purpose. And this is incredibly important for leaders to do for any sort of innovation. Here's a quote from the chairman of the board of trustees at another Kuwaiti organization, the American University. And you'll be familiar with this. He makes the point that Kuwait's economy is built largely around oil-based wealth distribution. If we rely on that continually, that will lead to disaster. So instead, he says, we must nurture in young people an appreciation of work and productivity and encourage them to produce. I fully agree. However, I don't believe that simply encouraging people who already have the benefits of distribution to produce more because it's a good thing is enough by itself. We have to think about what motivates people. And that's where we come back to this idea of purpose and a really clear outcome people can work towards. At One Leap, we use a model which we call the guiding star. And it's a very, very simple model when we're trying to help leaders get their people aligned around innovating. So we say, be really clear on the outcome, literally paint a picture of what good looks like, be really clear on why you're pursuing it so it's motivating. Then the next step is you put in place the guide rails. Say, you're going towards this concrete outcome, but you have to work within these parameters. And the combined effect of those two things is that a team can be told the general outcome they're heading towards, and as they move along the way, they find that certain things, certain ideas don't work. So they have to zigzag a bit or pivot, as we sometimes say. They're experimenting, but they still have to experiment within those guide rails, which might be, don't embarrass the stakeholder, don't spend more than X amount of money. But the point is, they are able to get on themselves with pursuing that guiding star or that outcome because they know where they're going and they've got very clear guidelines around how far they're allowed to go to get there. It seems really simple, but most of the time it simply doesn't happen in large organizations. Let me give you an example of what one of these guiding stars looked like. This is Bill Gates when he was considerably younger. And he set out very, very clearly, I want this organization to produce a computer on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software by the end of the decade, right? That's a really clear picture. You can actually see in your mind's eye what it would be to have a computer on every desk and in every home. And it allows the people coming up with ideas to respond to that direction. Because if you know that and you are working in research and development around around hardware, mainframes, you know that it's impossible to carry on building and innovating really big computers that take up whole rooms because they cannot fit on every desk and every home. Likewise, if you're in product development, if you know it's got to be on every desk and every home, you know you can't produce this amazing machine that is unaffordable to 99% of the population. So the power of that really clear guiding star is that all the ideas that you can activate, the collective genius, as Greg Brando at Pixar called it, can be targeted around a very clear direction, and then you'll get there a lot faster. Let me give you another example, also from the airline industry. So British Airways at one point was losing the transatlantic, basically New York to London business class market for the flights overnight. And it's a very important market to win, because it's how most airlines in the Western Hemisphere make most of their money. It's a classic business route, New York to London. And so he set out the guiding star. He said, whatever else is going on, we are all about creating an experience where travelers who fly from New York to London wake up and arrive ready to do business. And then he asked all the departments to think how they could contribute to that very clear outcome. And again, you can imagine what that looks like. You're a business person, you get on the plane in New York, you're tired, you know it's only a 6.5-hour flight, you're not going to get much sleep. You're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to go straight into a meeting because that's the expectation. What do you need to arrive ready for business? Well, if you're in the catering department and you hear that, you might say to yourself, I know what I could do. I could offer a full meal in the lounge beforehand, which means when the traveler gets onto the plane, rather than waiting for the meals to come around, they can immediately go to sleep. So they'll be well slept and arrive ready to do business. If you're in facilities management at the other end, you could think, to arrive ready to do business, you have to look and feel your best. How about a shower on arrival? How about having a suit pressing service? If you're in ground management at the other end, you might think, arriving ready to do business, you don't want to be stressed and worried about connections. Let's have a car service pick you up straight away. So you can see how all these ideas, which were executed and became excellent commercial innovations, were inspired by a very clear guiding star. They weren't just different ways that we could improve the business class experience. They were all targeted around one clear promise and outcome, which is we are going to create an outcome where our travelers arrive ready to do business. Very simple, but very powerful. So the conclusion here is that guided autonomy enables people to experiment and try different things out within those guidelines that you set, and it enables people to pull in the same direction. So we're not just creating hundreds of ideas, most of which we won't have time to focus on because they're not as important. I'm just going to skip this for the sake of time, but I want to move to the next barrier, which is the importance of leaders modeling a pragmatic approach to risk, and remembering that risk is also an emotional concept, not just a practical one. So it seems, again, straightforward, but many people forget that risk is an equation with two parts, probability and impact. In other words, a risk is the probability the bad thing will happen multiplied by what will be the actual impact if it does happen. And this stops innovation in a lot of organizations. I know public sector organizations, educational organizations can be quite conservative. And a lot of the time, it's because the culture develops where all risks are treated as probability. In other words, we're focused on how likely it is that we'll fail, even if that failure doesn't really matter. And I once had this experience going to a heavy industrials company in the United States. And I talked to their managing director there. And the first thing he said to me was, Hamish, great to see your team here. But just so you know, when you innovate where we work, people die. That was literally the beginning of the engagement. You can see it was going to be a challenging one. And so what we did is we went out and we found a department within this big industrial complex that we were absolutely confident that even if the experiment we wanted to do failed, the impact would be almost negligible. And it was really, really hard, but one of the junior team went down to the purchasing department, and they discovered that this company hadn't changed its stationery acquisition for 25 years. And as a consequence, they were paying 1,000% more than any other company should for paper clips and stationery and other such things. So just to make the point, we said to them, look, you could go and try a different stationery provider. You could try purchasing online. you might fail, you might end up with a whole pile of pink paper clips, and people might think that's a little bit silly, we don't like pink paper clips. But what would be the impact of that? Certainly no one would die, and certainly there'd be no functional consequence. You will, however, save at least $1 million over a year because you've been paying 1,000% more. So the point here is that leaders can get things started in risk-averse environments by finding agreed spaces where even if the experiment fails, the impact is basically negligible. And that's how we build the muscle to innovate within an organization. I want to come back to this burning platform again, because it is critiqued for a reason. And one of the reasons it's critiqued is that it's great during a crisis, but afterwards, having an environment that feels scary all the time is not a good way to make innovation work over the long term. And again, the authors of Collective Genius that I quoted before, Harvard professor Linda Hill and Greg Brando, from a practice point of view, emphasize that leaders should focus on creating the ability, the resources necessary, the conditions to do things, but also the willingness, so that people can take these emotional risks and look silly and fail. And here we have quite a strong opinion that we've developed for many years of working in this space, and it's that leaders have to experience this for themselves. We have a workshop, which is a very conservative way of describing the experience, but we call it a venture sprint, that was featured in one of the Harvard Business Review articles that was mentioned before. And essentially what it does is it puts leaders in a position where they have to do some really bold innovations within 48 hours. And I gave a guest lecture at Harvard University a few years ago on this, and these were the slides I used then. And basically the scenario was, we were working with I can mention the company because it's used in the lecture, Tesco, big global retailer. They were losing out in their Asian markets in Thailand to little local food stores, and they wanted to know why. And we knew it wasn't cost, and we knew it wasn't quality. It was something to do with the whole experience, which really matters in many of those Southeast Asian markets. So people weren't buying in their stores, they were buying from these little local wet markets that you can see pictured here. So our hypothesis was it was all about experience, and the challenge was we need to test whether that would make a difference if we could make that happen in our stores. And we've only got 48 hours to do it, but we can't just write about it. We have to actually make it happen. And so our team, combined with some of the entrepreneurs we work with and these senior leaders, most of whom were used to being in charge of 5,000 to 10,000 people each, went out and had a go at this. And it was really hard for them. So they went out to these markets. They realized they were running out of time, tried to convince some of these people to walk away from their markets for the afternoon, paid them to leave their little stalls to come into the Tesco stores. They then had to hop on motorcycles to get across the midday traffic to get there in time. They then had to set up a product in store called I Cook For You. So they got these local providers to set up stands and create experiences like they would be in local markets inside the store. They had to go out and buy things, set up stages. They had to do all of these very practical things very, very quickly. They had to spend money that they didn't know which budget it came from. They felt uncomfortable about that. They felt they should do more analysis. They worried they would look stupid. And at each point, even though they were the most senior people in the organization, they kept second guessing themselves. The entrepreneurs, by the way, didn't. And when we debriefed that experience, it was amazingly successful. That the stores that implemented this in 48 hours sold 400% more of the things, the products that were part of the experience than the stores that didn't. But all the leaders agreed that they were absolutely terrified about taking these risks, even though they knew that the amount of money at stake was very, very little. And they just weren't clear if they had permission to do the things, even though they were in charge of 10,000 people each. But after they had an experience like that, we were able to go back with them and redesign some of the rules and put in place these stars and the guidelines, so it was much easier for the people they led to do it. Now, that's what we did in this case. There are lots of different ways you can do that, but my strong conviction is that leaders have to experience that themselves before they really understand what the emotional risk feels like to be out there, being rejected by customers, feeling anxious about the speed at which they're moving. Because only then do you realize what you need to do to set the stage for the people that you lead. The last one I'll call removing friction. And the idea here is really like power lines. The further an idea has to travel, the more likely it is to die. Just like when electricity is generated, you've got lots of voltage near the plant, but the further it goes, the more the electricity loses power. And with ideas, it's very similar. What happens in most organizations is they're a pyramid. And in a case like this, the idea is that an idea is generated by somebody who's working with a student or working at administration at the bottom of the organization. And if it's going to be executed, it has to go into a suggestion box and get to the top of the organization. And there, the very smart people in the leadership will pull out one lucky idea every month and it will happen. Well, we've been involved in situations like that many times, and it almost always fails because people have got lots of great ideas. They all put them in the box. The person in charge at the top gets overwhelmed. The people who gave the ideas don't get any feedback, and then they conclude reasonably that that person doesn't care what they think. So what needs to happen instead is almost all of the ideas need to be executed where they start. And again, that's the importance of that clear guiding star and those clear guidelines. And they might be, if it costs less than X amount of money, if it doesn't affect any other department, just go and do it. You have your own team meeting at a team manager level and make it happen. The idea doesn't have to travel very far from the person who came up with it, so it will probably work. Some ideas might have to travel across the organization. So maybe every couple of months you have a interdepartment ideas meeting to pick some of those ideas and then track their execution. But very few ideas should actually have to move up to the top. And if they do have to move up to the top, they should again be in response to a very clear direction, because otherwise you'll just get overwhelmed with the sheer quantity of ideas and the leadership will ignore them. So allow as many ideas as possible to just happen. Some will just fizzle out by themselves. Some will blossom. And then by all means, you can expand their use throughout the organization. But try to avoid the classic suggestion box mechanism that leaders can never keep up with, because it ruins the culture of an organization when you don't have time to give people feedback. So that's the 4 in summary. Leaders need to focus on reversing a lack of ambition by setting their sights right from the beginning, ensuring there is that clear direction and permission, which is what a guiding star and guide rails provides, doing everything they can to remove that culture of risk aversion, breaking down that equation, exposing themselves to those emotional risks, and being really focused on setting the stage, not worried about being the first violinist. And finally, doing everything possible to remove those little bits of bureaucracy so ideas can move faster and things can happen. And that's where I think I should leave it. They are my 4 final thoughts. I will summarize by saying, if there is one term that I think captures the mindset that is needed by leaders, as I said at the beginning, it is that of an entrepreneurial mindset, because it's the entrepreneurial mindset that is ambitious. It's the entrepreneurial mindset that wants to move quickly. It's the entrepreneurial mindset that doesn't need to be the inventor, but wants to tap the collective genius of others. And it's the entrepreneurial mindset that wants to take all the friction out so we can let innovation happen. And that is me. So I'd be delighted now to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hamish. It was a really interesting topic to be discussed, a great presentation, great lessons to be learned from it. And definitely we can relate many issues you have discussed with Kuwaiti setting, Kuwaiti educational setting. I agree with you that COVID-19 was a huge tragedy, but at the same time, it's a big opportunities that we have to make use of it. And we may not have this similar opportunities in the near future. Many elements or many things you have talked about, like the need to reduction of bureaucracy, problems like lack of autonomy, lack of ambition, negative impact of bureaucracy. These are elements we can relate to the Kuwaiti setting, and these are, we can say it could be the reasons that we have recently a low quality issues in education. I will let, we will have some questions from the attendees.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question I have, it's a good question. It's related to the emotional risk we have talked about. How can we deal with the frustration due to COVID-19?
How can we deal with the frustration due to COVID-19? Are there any particular frustrations or just in general?
I think it's in general, but maybe it's related to, I think it's a question from a student. Maybe they have some negative emotions related to what happened to education due to this crisis.
Yeah. Look, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it is a crisis, and we've been talking about all the upsides, but a lot of people have been hurt very, very badly by this. I think one of the things is that we haven't in recent history had a comparable scale of crisis that's affected people everywhere in the world. And what we do know with any great disruptions is that young people are disproportionately impacted. If you think back to, and it's not anything near the scale of COVID, but the great financial recession in 2008, 2009, young people had every right to feel very frustrated. Youth unemployment in many countries was extremely high as a consequence of that. But I think there are a number of things that we can do to face those frustrations head on. The first is to recognize that there are new opportunities opening up. So there are opportunities that simply did not exist pre-COVID. There's an article yesterday, for example, in the New York Times, one of the people who works in One Leap's team changed country as a result of many frustrations around COVID, the difficulty getting proper pregnancy care, for example, being one of them, and made a huge life shift to the other side of the world as a result of that. And has been able to continue working because of the nature of her work as a consequence of that. That is an opportunity to reach out to opportunities in other places, even other countries, that simply would not have been available before. So the first thought is to focus on some of those upsides that didn't exist. The second thought is perhaps to spend some time working collectively with a group of other people who can support you working through that, and make small practical steps that you can hold each other accountable around. So these are sometimes called mastermind circles. So I know at a number of universities, students will get together on a regular basis, and they will take turns at focusing on the challenges or frustrations each has, and they will put together their collective mastermind to help brainstorm and develop those solutions, but not just do that, but help that person be accountable in moving through their response to those. And I think the final thought is this will pass. It's something that has impacted almost everyone. So no one is alone in their frustrations around this. But we are rapidly seeing the world bouncing back. Already a lot of the economic predictions of a massive recession have proved false. So there is good reason for optimism if we can continue in that innovative spirit.
We are checking now another question, and we will inshallah send it to you.
Sure.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question, another important question. We have talked about leadership and the importance of leadership. So do you think the one who should be in the leadership position, they should be specialized in the academic sector, or they should be specialized in the business administration, for example, to have more innovation leadership?
It's a good question, and I don't pretend expertise in your particular sector. But what I would say is, to come back to the advice before, that whoever leads an effort to drive innovation in an organization does not need to be the first violinist. They do not need to be the most innovative or the most expert person. And in fact, if they are, that can be an active disadvantage, because they're putting their time and their energies into innovating themselves and coming up with ideas rather than creating the conditions that we talked about. And doing that is a full-time job. That's the first thought. The second thought is that the skill set needed to create the conditions in which it is safe to innovate. And what I mean by that is where people feel happy experimenting and failing and don't lose career progress as a result, or an environment in which it's safe to have arguments, as long as it's understood that the purpose of the argument is not to win and be right, but the purpose of the argument is to drive better ideas and better thinking. Those sort of skills are typically stakeholder and people skills. And although there are experts in knowledge who also have those, often they can come from two different worlds. So I think it could be somebody who had expertise in the field, but I don't think it's essential. I think what's more important is whether somebody is prepared to put aside some of their own ambitions to develop the best idea, so that they can instead focus on activating the best thinking from other people.
Thank you. I have another comment. Innovation leads to success even with risks or failure. So we have talked about taking risk. How far can a leader go in taking risk, especially after COVID-19? It's a risk by itself. It's arised many risks. So after COVID-19, maybe leaders will be afraid to take more risks.
Mm-hmm. I think that will definitely be true in some organizations. You get a phenomenon which is called crisis wariness. People are just so exhausted operating in a crisis situation, which requires so much inventiveness, so much risk-taking, that they just need a break. And I fully understand that phenomenon. I think on the other hand, there is a unique opportunity now to stand back and recognize that we have built these muscles to be more experimental, to be more agile, to be more reasonable about risks and more forgiving, because we recognize that they're part of the learning process. And it would be a real shame to lose that. So I'm not advocating that leaders should just go out and take risks for the sake of it. There is intelligent risk-taking and there is irresponsible risk-taking. Intelligent risk-taking is when a risk is taken for the purpose of learning, and you're not doing the same thing and expecting different results. It's done intentionally, it's evaluated honestly, and it exists within parameters that you've set out at the beginning. You know exactly why you're doing it. So in sum, I would say, number one, people need to breathe in and exhale, and I understand that's very real, but I would be very wary about losing the momentum, given we've shown what we can do through COVID. I'd be particularly wary about rolling back any of the adaptations that you've made too quickly, because it's very easy to carry on doing something. It's very hard to reverse our behavior once it's started. And then secondly, I think that the next step is to put in place a really clear direction around where we're taking risks, where we're experimenting, why we're doing it, and what a good risk looks like, being really, really clear about what those conditions are. And that's about transparency, and it's about honesty about the experiment that's being undertaken.
Thank you very much. I think we have came to the end of our presentation. I really enjoyed the topic discussed. I thank you personally, Mr. Hamish, for this excellent presentation and excellent lesson we have learned from it. I'd like to thank the Center of Education Development Center in College of Education, guided by Dr. Aisha Al-Azmi. I'd like to thank Ms. Anwar for her help. I'd like to thank the attendees. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamish. Is there something you would like to say at the end?
Thank you, Dr. Munira. Thank you, Dr. Aisha, and I wish you all the very best of luck with your pursuits as you build your own reset moment. Shukran.
Shukran. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
نشكر مركز التطوير حضورنا الكرام على تواجدهم معنا في هذه الفعالية، ونأمل تواجدكم القادم في الفعاليات القادمة بإذن الله تعالى. الشكر الجزيل للجميع.